Hello, Nutmeggers. Thank you for joining us on another edition of Primo Nutmeg. By the way, if you are a regular listener, please do like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to us on YouTube, SoundCloud, and iTunes. Today on the show, I have Medea Benjamin. She is the founder of CODEPINK, as well as the author of Drone Warfare, Killing by Remote Control, and a new book called Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. Hope you enjoy. So, Medea, thank you very much for being on Primo Nutmeg today.
Thanks for having me on.
Now, you just came out with a new book. It's called Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, and I really want to talk about that. But you have a very extensive career as a peace activist, as the founder of CODEPINK, and I just kind of wanted to go over that a little bit. Particularly, I think you are probably the most prolific protester that I know of in the U.S. right now. You just recently got kicked out of the GOP convention, and I believe that is the fourth time that has happened, correct?
At a convention?
At the GOP convention. You've been to the Democratic ones too, right?
Yes. We're equal opportunity protesters, so yes.
So, I mean, I was just looking over some of your greatest hits today. So back in 2004, you were kicked out of the GOP convention when you were asking Dick Cheney how much Halliburton had made from Iraq. Then 2008, you were protesting Sarah Palin. 2012, you actually interrupted Mitt Romney's acceptance speech. And then 2016, now you just got kicked out of the GOP convention for protesting Donald Trump. What was
you
that?
Did good homework.
Well, in addition to that, I was looking up other things as well. So 2013, at the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, you got kicked out for asking John Kerry not to invade Syria. In 2006, the Iraqi Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki, he was giving a speech before the joint session of Congress, and you got kicked out for interrupting him there. 2013, you heckled Barack Obama several times over not closing Gitmo and drone warfare. And then 2015, I think that was probably the most famous instance when Henry Kissinger was speaking to Congress. You and some other CODEPINK activists got kicked out of that session for calling for his arrest, and John McCain called you low-life scum.
So I might as well add that this morning, I got kicked out of John McCain hearing.
Oh, really? What for?
The Secretary of Defense, Ashton Carter, was there. And, oh, gosh, I mean, it's really hard to sit still in these things when they're talking about why are all these terrorist attacks, and the day before they had just voted to authorize more weapons to Saudi Arabia. So I had to stand up and say something.
My first question about this is, how do you get into all these different conventions and sessions of Congress? And I mean, eventually they figured they wouldn't let you in, right?
Well, sessions of Congress, if you're the first online, they're supposed to let you in. Sometimes they look for reasons not to, but they're really not allowed to not let you in. What they can do is tell you while you're waiting online, you'll be arrested if you speak out, if you take out a sign or anything like that. And then these other conventions and things, we actually get people who give us credentials. Nice.
So you're going in as a member of the press or as a delegate?
No, as a delegate.
Really? So you're serving as a Republican delegate? It's pretty fun.
Yeah. There's always somebody who doesn't like Trump or who doesn't like Hillary Clinton or, whatever. And they say, here, take my credential.
So out of all these instances and your other activism that is similar to this, what was the most fun time for you?
Well, the most fun time is when we get to be with our colleagues from other countries in a non-war kind of setting, like World Social Forums that have been happening every couple of years, and sometimes they're in Latin America, which I love, or the one before this was in Tunisia. Get to learn about other countries and meet people around the world who are trying to build a more peaceful, green, sustainable economy. I would say those are the best times.
So I did want to talk a little bit more about your anti-war activism. I just had Cindy Sheehan on a few weeks ago, and she really went into a lot of detail explaining why the anti-war movement fell apart. The Bush era anti-war movement was so strong, and now it seems to not really exist that much anymore. So she gave some insight into that and explaining the big conflict between United for Peace and Justice and Answer and the split that they had, and then also talked about Democrats kind of slowly kind of taking over the movement. I just would be interested to hear your perspective on that as well. Why did that mid-2000s Bush era anti-war movement collapse?
Well, I don't know exactly what she said, but from your summary of it, I would probably take issue with that and say that I don't think it was so much a split between different groups. I think it was because people were very excited that Obama was going to lead us to the promised land and we didn't have to do anything. And also because of the financial crisis that hit people so hard, they didn't have the funds to come and lobby in Washington, D.C. or go out to protest. They had to try to save their homes or their college education. So my sense is more that those things were what led to the collapse of the anti-war movement. When people start fighting with each other internally, it's more because things have shrunk so much. When you're a big movement, you can accommodate those differences.
So now that we're coming to the end of President Obama's administration, how would you evaluate his term as president?
Well, it's so mixed. I think there are certainly people who love him very much, and especially in the Black community where they are extremely proud of him. And then there's people like myself who have focused a lot on the war and peace issues who were extremely disappointed in him. And we look at these years and see the Middle East in more turmoil than ever before. We see these flashpoints around the world that are very dangerous. We see that he promised to close down Guantanamo and never did it, even in the first 2 years when he had the opportunity to do so. I did a book on drone warfare, and so I'm very upset with President Obama for having taken this weapon of killing by remote control to new extremes. So it depends who you ask.
Do you think that President Obama could have been impeached for the way that he used drones?
No, I mean, if George Bush was never impeached for invading Iraq, then Obama's not going to get impeached for using drones. You know, we live in the superpower, and who's ever in charge of these superpowers never has to say they're sorry, just like the United States doesn't have to say it's sorry, whether it's for the destruction of entire nations like Iraq, or go back to Vietnam and Laos, or the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. There's what comes with the territory of power is that people tend not to acknowledge their wrongdoing and apologize.
So let's talk about your book. This book just came out a few weeks ago, Kingdom of the Unjust, Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection. And I wanted to ask you, why did you write this book now, and why did you decide to publish it in the midst of a presidential campaign?
Well, I should have written it about 50 years ago, but I didn't know better. And it came out around a presidential campaign because this is a time when people are talking politics and a good time to insert another issue into the mix. It's been very interesting that Saudi Arabia has been more in the news recently than before around the war that it's waging in Yemen, as well as a new bill that Congress passed allowing 9/11 families to sue Saudi Arabia in U.S. courts. But otherwise, Saudi Arabia doesn't come up very much in the U.S. news, and the American public is pretty ignorant, might have a kind of yucky feeling about Saudi Arabia, but doesn't know much about the details, and I felt it was important to do a basic primer on what is Saudi Arabia, where does this kingdom come from, how did it start, what is Wahhabism, how does it treat its own people, and then how does it deal with its neighbors and the rest of the world. And so that's the book, a really basic book about a country that we really need to know a lot more about so that we can work to change our government's relationship with it.
And we really do have a very involved relationship. The United States government and the Saudi government are very strong partners. How did this come to be? What is the history of the relationship between our two governments?
Well, certainly, were it not for oil, Saudi Arabia wouldn't have this immense impact on the world, and the U.S. wouldn't be so cozy with it. So it goes back to the issue of oil, but over the years, the Saudis have been very brilliant in investing their oil money in the U.S. economy and U.S. businesses, the stock market, treasury bonds, you name it, and then giving money to institutions. I mentioned I was in McCain's hearing this morning. I just for fun Googled McCain in Saudi Arabia, and it turns out that Bloomberg News just said in March that his institute had taken $1 million from the Saudis. So wherever you look, there is Saudi money being used to bribe, cajole, silence, in some way put a happy spin on this terrible, terrible, abusive kingdom.
A lot of what I read about the relationship between the two countries seems to revolve around something that happened in the early 1970s when Henry Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia and instituted the petrodollar system. Could you go into a little detail about that, explaining how our economies and currencies are somewhat intertwined via petrodollars?
Well, all of the sales of oil are in dollars. So right there, that ties our economy. In fact, it was quite ironic when the Congress passed this legislation that would allow Saudi Arabia to be sued in U.S. courts. The Saudi government threatened to withdraw $750 billion in assets from the U.S. economy. But then folks said, well, that's going to hurt the Saudis because the oil sales are in dollars and they need a strong dollar. So, yes, the two economies are very intertwined, but I wouldn't place it in the 70s. I would go back to the founding of oil in the 1930s by what is now Chevron, and the famous meeting with Franklin Delano Roosevelt in 1945 around World War II, when we really felt the need for Saudi oil and made the Oil for Security Pact. And for your listeners to recognize that this has gone on through Democratic and Republican administrations. In fact, for 12 different administrations, the U.S. and the Saudis have had these very close ties.
Now, you mentioned this legislation that is centered on letting 9/11 victims sue Saudi Arabia. Could you explain why 9/11 victims would want to sue Saudi Arabia and what the government of Saudi Arabia might have had to do with 9/11?
There are a number of 9/11 family members who feel they've never gotten the straight answers about what happened on 9/11. They know that 15 of the 19 hijackers were Saudis. They know that most of these were very uneducated men who hadn't spent much time in the United States, barely knew how to fly planes. And they know that there were other people who had to have coached them along and paid for this and want to get to the bottom of it. And the commissions that were looking into this right after 9/11 didn't get a chance to continue with a lot of the investigations. And there are tens of thousands of pages of information, according to former Senator Bob Graham, who headed the Senate Intelligence Committee, that should be released to the public, aren't being released, and would only be released if there was litigation and in the process of discovery, this information came out. So that's why many of these families want the right to sue the Saudi government, because they think after 15 years of demanding answers, it's about time they got more.
So last I knew, this legislation had been passed by Congress. However, the White House was trying to figure out a way not to sign it into law, and they were considering a pocket veto. Is that still the status, or has something changed there?
On Friday, tomorrow, there is going to be a presidential veto, most likely. And then the issue is, will Congress override that veto? It would be the first time in Obama's presidency that a veto was overridden, and the administration is putting a lot of pressure on members of Congress not to do that. But there are many members of Congress who feel like they owe it finally to the 9/11 family members. So it's going to be a very interesting week, the coming week.
Now let's talk about another piece of legislation too, because Senator Chris Murphy and Senator Rand Paul, they had sponsored this legislation to stop weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. Can you go into a little bit of detail, firstly, about the history of our weapons sales to Saudi Arabia, what we are selling them, and also this legislation, how it came about?
It's really remarkable, the level of weapons sales. I had no idea that Saudi Arabia had not only become the number one purchaser of weapons, but under the Obama administration, we've had the largest weapons sales that we've ever had in our history. And this is to a country that beheads peaceful dissidents, that doesn't allow a church to be built, that keeps women as in a position of minors, no matter what their age, the only country that doesn't allow women to drive, the country that spreads extreme ideology around the world, the country that's committing war crimes in Yemen with weapons that are being sold by the U.S., including cluster bombs and white phosphorus. And you think, my goodness, how is it that under just Obama's administration, we've sold $110 billion worth of weapons to the regime that's most responsible for extremism in the world?
Now, you mentioned Yemen. Can you explain a little bit what is going on in Yemen and why Saudi Arabia is fighting Yemen or bombing Yemen?
Saudi Arabia has had an antagonistic relationship for a long time with Iran that got even worse after the Iranian Revolution in 1979, when the Saudis saw Iran as a rival for the guardianship of the Muslim world. And in neighboring Yemen, there are two factions that are fighting each other. The Saudis were worried that Iran would come in to support one faction, and so the Saudis went in to support the other faction. They thought it would be quick and dirty, but it's been over 18 months now. Thousands and thousands of Saudi airstrikes, in fact, almost 7,000, and a third of them have been hitting civilian targets. So imagine what the Yemenis who look at this situation and see U.S. weapons, U.S. logistics, U.S. refueling of jets in the air, U.S. intelligence. They say, yes, these are Saudi weapons, but they wouldn't be allowed to use them were it not for U.S. support. So we have blood on our hands for all these innocent people being killed, and the catastrophic situation in Yemen right now, with 80% of the country dependent on humanitarian aid, with people facing famine-like conditions, and with bombs dropping daily on their schools and hospitals and clinics and residential neighborhoods and factories and infrastructure. It's just terrible.
And unfortunately, that's not the only crisis in the Middle East right now. We also have what's going on in Syria. Is the Saudi government at all responsible or involved in what's happening in Syria?
Well, some people say ISIS has a mother and father. The mother was the U.S. invasion of Iraq that unleashed the sectarian hatred, and the father was the Saudi Wahhabi ideology that gives license to kill people who are not following the same strain of Islam as they are. And so the Saudis have provided the ideological basis for ISIS. They were very embarrassed when it turned out that ISIS in the territory that it controlled was using Saudi textbooks in their schools. There are also lots of ways that Saudi money from individuals, from, quote, charities, have been going to support extremist groups in Syria. And the government itself has been supporting what until recently was called Al-Nusra Front, changed its name, but it is the Al-Qaeda affiliate in Syria. So certainly Saudi Arabia is playing a very dirty role in Syria, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Libya, and as we talked about before, in Yemen.
Something else where I've heard Saudi Arabia come up a lot often is the discussion of the Clinton Foundation and the leaked emails surrounding that. Could you talk a little bit about Saudi Arabia, the Saudi Arabian government's relationship with the Clinton Foundation, and what the State Department did during Hillary Clinton's administration?
The Saudis have been major donors to the Clinton Foundation. On the foundation's own website, you see them in the category of between $10 and $25 million donors. And yet when Hillary Clinton was Secretary of State, there are leaked cables that show how disgusted she was with the Saudis because they were funding all these extremist groups around the world. Instead of using her position as Secretary of State to try to impose sanctions on the Saudis, she instead okayed massive amounts of weapons sales. And not only that, a major contributor to her campaign, a bundler for her, and the brother of the chair of her presidential campaign is Tony Podesta of the Podesta Group, who is a paid foreign agent of the Saudi government receiving $140,000 every month from the Saudis. So the ties with Clinton are deep and are nefarious.
So, again, with the backdrop of this presidential campaign, that kind of involvement seems very damning when you talk about a regime as horrible as the Saudi government, which, really sounds like one of the worst regimes on earth. And you talk about Hillary Clinton receiving upwards of $10 million via the Clinton Foundation and providing these arms to the Saudi Arabian government. Again, in the backdrop of this election, do you think that disqualifies her from being president?
Well, then that would leave us with Trump, wouldn't it?
Unless people voted for Jill Stein or Gary Johnson.
Yes, but I don't think enough people are going to do that, unfortunately. That's not the way our system is set up. And so does it disqualify her? I mean, the whole system is rotten. I mentioned how I was in John McCain's hearing this morning, and you just look around at all those senators, and they're on the take from the weapons industry, and they're on the take from the oil companies and the pharmaceutical companies and big corporate powers. So it's the system itself that is so corrupt. And Hillary Clinton, I think, is just a reflection of that.
I'd actually be interested to hear your thoughts on Bernie Sanders as well, because I actually saw him speak in person a couple times, and he brought up Saudi Arabia and said that Saudi Arabia should be involved in a coalition against ISIS. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, I was disappointed that Bernie Sanders didn't speak more about foreign policy in general, didn't talk about the need to cut the Pentagon's bloated budget, didn't bring up in fact, talked favorably about the use of drones. He was so good on so many other issues, but on foreign policy, he was not great. The only really good thing I think he did was to talk about Palestinians having rights, which is something you never hear mainstream candidates talking about. But in terms of the Saudis, I think he took a line that was almost similar to Donald Trump in a way of the Saudis should be doing more of the fighting. Donald Trump says the Saudis should be paying for it. those are really not solutions, because the Saudis themselves are run by a group of extremists. So you certainly don't want them doing the fighting, because then it would be people beholden to the Saudis who would take over.
One thing that I will say to his credit is this past week, when there was this legislation to stop the sales of arms to Saudi Arabia, Bernie Sanders did co-sponsor or vote in favor of that. Can you talk a little bit just about, I guess, Congress as a whole? Do you think that there are legitimate moves in a positive direction like that, where something can actually be accomplished? Or, you know, I believe that the vote on that was 23 in favor. So, you know, looking back again to the mid-2000s, when you had Congress that seemed to be a little bit more against the Iraq War, do you think that Congress can actually stand up and A, stop sales of weapons to Saudi Arabia, B, override the veto that President Obama may have for that legislation tomorrow? Do you think that they can actually stand up and be a voice of the American people?
Well, there are individuals who can, but as a body, they're not, don't have much of a record of doing that. And I think it goes back to the issue of who got them elected, in the sense of who paid for their campaigns, who are they beholden to. And then we get back to this issue of corporate money in politics and what a corrosive influence that has. So, yeah, you find some good individuals here and there, but it's hard to extrapolate that into having a majority that can do something like stand up to the administration on this issue of weapon sales. So it's good we're going in the direction that at least some of them are now, or at least are questioning this. But we are not yet at the point of having majority. And for that, we need a public that's much more educated and mobilized and cares about these issues. Because if they're not hearing from us, they certainly are hearing from the weapons manufacturers. So we have to make our voices a lot louder.
Now that Ron Paul and Dennis Kucinich are no longer in Congress, who would you say are the best members of Congress now?
Well, Keith Ellison is very good. Barbara Lee is good on these issues. There are some of the oldies but goodies like John Conyers. I was just in Madison, where their representative is Mark Pocan, who is quite good on these issues. Jan Schakowsky, those are some of the ones I would say.
So would you say that these folks are receptive to CODEPINK's message generally? You know, you've been in Washington, been active for about 15 years now, I believe. Do you think that you have a solid base of support where there are actually members of Congress who are receptive to your message?
We have a way too small a base of support within Congress, because there is the Progressive Caucus, but within that, I would say maybe about a third of them are with us on most of these issues, and that's even in the Progressive Caucus. So it's we have, I would say, about 36 out of 435.
So could you tell us about any upcoming events that CODEPINK might be holding? I think actually, as we're recording this, there's a protest against Kissinger and Netanyahu going on in New York, correct?
Oh, yes, that's right. A doubleheader. 2 war criminals for the price of one. So, yes, we do have people protesting there. I can't wait to hear about it. And we will be continuing to push this issue about weapons sales to Saudi Arabia. We'll continue to push the issue about we have to be an even-handed broker in the Middle East, including around Israel and Palestine. We'll be pushing the bigger issues. In the year to come, we'd like to start a campaign that is about divesting from the weapons industry, just as the environmentalists have done such a good job about divesting from the fossil fuel industry. And we have worked around divesting from the companies supporting the Israeli military. So those are some of the things. And the last thing I'd like to say is we also have a relatively new campaign about building the peace economy. So while we're talking about what we want to dismantle, we have to talk about what we want to build, how we want to live in our communities. And it's been a very positive thing to have that program that gives people a vision and things they can do that integrate them within the community, that use their dollars in a positive way to keep the money locally and to form a challenge to the big corporate military-industrial complex.
Well, Medea Benjamin, founder of CODEPINK, author of Kingdom of the Unjust Behind the U.S.-Saudi Connection, thank you very much for being on the show today, and thank you for all of your activism, for your years of standing up for peace. Just as somebody who's been involved in the anti-war movement, I really do appreciate your leadership and moral consistency on these issues.
Terrific. Thanks so much for having me on.
Thank you. Well, folks, thanks for listening. Once again, please do like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter, and subscribe to us on YouTube and iTunes. Also, if you enjoyed this episode, please do look for other editions of Primo NUTMEG featuring MIT professor Noam Chomsky, Green Party nominee Jill Stein, and antivirus programmer John McAfee. Until next time.